All right, welcome to this discussion. We are going to be talking about communism, the Red Scare, and aftermath of that. So, post World War II is the time period we're looking at, and how its effect on American culture and specifically the church too. What happens with all of that? So then post World War II, right? Everything seemed to be at first, right? We won,
Right.
we won. So why is it then that there was suddenly this trouble, or did the trouble actually sort of begin before the war ended? And
This is going to go into a weird direction
I
right here, but
know, but
you haven't served in a unit that was originally under General Patton. You probably know a little bit about this. There's some suggestion that Patton was assassinated. And I think some of that has a lot to do with the idea that Patton was for dispensing with the alliance with the Soviet Union and just let's go ahead and deal with this now.
because we're already at war.
Right.
Yeah,
And that's during World War II. That's not aftermath. That's like
that,
we're encountering them in Europe, and it's got some issues.
so if people are already, if it's already on their mind that this is going to be a problem
Right.
and the war isn't over, right? Then something has to be happening that shows why this is going to be a problem. Is there a thing that we can point to, or is it sort of a series of events?
I think from the get go, there's a fear of communism, and I think a lot of it goes back to the way that it came about. You know, the stirrings of communism start completely in a different country, right? And it translates over to Russia, Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And the way it does so is very bloody and violent. And so there's a fear of that. And then, from the outside looking in, we know that it always leads to a dictatorship, which we are, as Americans, pro democracy, pro republic, we are adamantly opposed to dictatorships.
Well, I mean, the people that were settling here, as we've discussed in other episodes, right?
Right.
They're settling here for what reason? To get away from.
We want political freedom.
That's
right.
What
we want.
Freedom. And specifically religious freedom, neither of which you get
in the ultimate that Soviet communism, which I would say is probably the ultimate form of communism. That's what you get. You lose complete political freedom. It's all gone. There is no political freedom, and I think that's anathema to us as Americans.
Well, like at first, it's not that we didn't like it before, because I don't think America did. These communist ideas. I think the fear level started to kick in.
Right.
To use some modern terminology. The Bush era, right? Where it was like yellow alert, right?
I think you have to go back to Reagan for that.
No, true.
Yeah.
But I just mean that every day on the news, I remember after 9/11 there was the terror level alert.
But almost in the way that the military would treat like DEFCON 1 and 2.
Exactly. So, but if you go into the end of World War II and the way things start to get carved up,
right?
Who's claiming this or that? And when people start all grabbing for things,
right?
That is what I think drove the fear of it. Right?
Well, and not only that, when you see that taking place, you see Britain, the United States, Canada, and all the others involved with that. You see them kind of peacefully moving into countries and helping out and that sort of thing.
Asia is where I'm specifically thinking.
And well, that's another ball of wax. Yeah. But talking about Eastern Europe for a minute, that's the Soviet Union actually makes military moves into those regions, and it's aggressive.
Yeah.
And you end up with the puppet states and what Winston Churchill is going to call the Iron Curtain.
Yeah.
And that's really where your Cold War, that's really where it kicks off. Asian side of the war, there's a big argument for, looking at why we dropped the atomic bomb.
Right.
From an American standpoint, it's largely a numbers game.
Yeah.
But when you dig into the politics of it, the Soviet Union had just finished its war against Germany. They had declared war on Japan and were going to come into the war. And we want to prevent their brand of communism from being in that part of Asia.
Right.
You end up with the entire North Korean situation because of that fact.
Yeah, because and then we don't know. But people are like, wait a minute, is somebody researching something here? Is somebody developing a weapon over here? Is there something else happening here? And then
Well, then you've also got the whole atomic
troops started showing up and saying, "Well, no need to come look here. We've already checked this place out. All's clear."
secrets
Right.
being leaked,
Yeah,
bombs being tested,
that's right.
and there is absolutely that fear.
That's right. They're sounding the all clear. Hey, there's no problem over here. You don't need to come look over here. Right. And
Yeah.
so all of that is happening. So there's already that wall of secrecy being put up of what did the Soviet Union find? What did they claim? You
Right.
know, and because communism isn't really a threat if it doesn't have any teeth.
Right.
You know, if there's no no real uh, ability to overcome anybody else, then it's just an idea.
Right.
But whenever it starts to become
on
an
paper,
active force,
I dare say on paper, it's actually a beautiful idea. It's cooperation between people and
sure,
a means to ending scarcity that is mutual. The problem with it is, and this is going to wax theological, is we're people and people have sin, and sin leads to corruption, and corruption leads to dictatorship.
well, and that ties in directly, I think, to the religious freedom idea because you can't have that kind of unity,
Right.
at least the one that they were proposing, if there are differing ideas about who God is, these sort of foundational kinds of concepts of, life
Right.
and liberty, if you have different views on all these things, you can't combine them and create this
Right.
mega empire. You can't do it.
Right.
It just doesn't work. And so communism only works if everybody's on that same page.
Right.
And so whoever the dictator is, whoever's in charge, they're the ones that are deciding what the page is.
Right. Well, and you have Karl Marx saying that religion is the opiate of the masses.
That's right. So you're going to use religion,
but they don't. Like the Soviet brand is state-sponsored atheism, which is a fear in and of itself if you're a religious person. So there's that going into that as well. That they would say godless communist. I don't want to be a godless communist.
Right. That's right. That's right.
So
all of this is happening. It's exploding on the political front, right? So if that's happening there, though, what's happening here in the United States because of that, I guess, because it doesn't stay rhetoric. It doesn't stay, well, I'm kind of moving in militarily into this area. All of a sudden, we find out it's not only us, right, that has atomic weapons anymore.
Right.
Right.
It's us and them.
It's us and them.
Right.
And if we were able to end a war with these weapons,
right.
Now they have these weapons,
right.
And we don't agree ideologically,
right.
about almost anything. We were allies, sure, but
allies against a greater enemy.
That's right.
Right.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend, kind of thing. But no more than that.
Right.
And at that point, they had become the new enemy, right? And so all that is happening. People don't want that kind of war anymore. So it begins to spill out into, I think, the theological talks.
An interesting point of view with that is when you look at Russian imperialism, right? And how the communist state in Russia comes to be. Communism should divorce imperialism, but when you look at Soviet policy, they're one and the same. They're connected.
Yeah.
It's meant to be an empire, a communistic empire, which doesn't even make sense. And that's a fearful thing.
Yeah.
Well,
because if the idea is that you're an empire, what empires do is they march in and conquer.
Right.
That is what an empire does.
So you have this idea of this ideology, which we are opposed to, with a conquering mindset.
Yeah.
We don't want to be conquered.
So on our end, then at the same time, we're trying not to go to war.
Right. So we come up with every means possible to try to resist it. You get George Marshall, who you were talking to me about earlier, the Marshall Plan,
Yeah.
where we're going to send money and aid to prevent communism at first. That's how it starts, right? Eventually, it does result in boots on the ground and hot wars in the middle of a Cold War. We get to that point.
Yeah.
But yeah, now domestically, I think is where we're aiming here. That the policies, obviously, they're talking about things in the newspaper, but then there's this wall of secrecy. You have the CIA that's been created and things like that, and
nobody's really sure what's going on anymore.
Right. There's our government has secrets, which is weird in a democracy.
Yes.
When you get down to thinking about it.
Because they're like, how can you have, because you fight what we call World War One, which was the Great War, and you think, well, we fixed it, right? The world's
supposed to be.
It's supposed to be fixed. The it's done. It's over. We fought the war.
Right.
It's over now. And then World War II happens.
Well, because we let Europe mishandle.
They did. They mishandled the way that the resolution of it.
Right.
And so now we end up with another war. And then at the close of that war, we can already see another war coming.
Now, the interesting thing about that is we've not seen its like again at this point.
That's true. That's true. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know that it would be like that again. You know what I mean?
I don't know if it can. So, we look at World War One as being the war to end all wars. But really, World War II,
it did it, actually.
It changed the world. It fundamentally changed the world. So war still exists, but not on that level.
No, I think nuclear weapons,
they're deterrents,
changed the face of the way that things would work.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we used it as a deterrent. And so if we say, you know what, we have to create stock of these things.
Right.
We started ramping up
mutually assured destruction, right?
Yeah, we ramp up testing on these things. So much so that I think I mentioned this previously in another episode, but if you grow vegetables in your garden at your house,
right,
and it was some heirloom seed, whatever, it's not been contaminated by anything, and you grow tomatoes on that thing, you can test it, and there's radioactive signatures in that tomato that will link back to Bikini Atoll and the atomic weapons.
It's our first thermonuclear explosion,
from rain. Yeah.
Yeah, the first hydrogen bomb, essentially. Yeah, we went a little wild with that. I mean, you could make a pretty good argument for why there's a lot of people with cancer today, and it goes back to our atomic testing.
I mean, we did some stuff, man. Well, there are actually people that did die from the testing.
Right.
In fact, John Wayne could be one of those casualties.
Yeah, that's
so. I mean, a lot of the people on that set.
I mean, he is pretty old, but I mean, he was pretty old.
He was, but it wasn't just him. I think there was a couple dozen people on the set of that particular movie, which was filmed in Arizona.
Right.
It was filmed near the nuclear.
Well, yeah, all his Republic movies are filmed out in the West, and that's where the majority of the tests are taking place.
They died of cancer, even young people.
Right.
And it was attributed to the nearness to nuclear test site facilities. So yeah, it obviously has an impact. To make a pun, but the other thing is that we see, okay, 2 of them ended that war.
Right.
How many do we need?
Well, and those were on the atomic level, right?
That's right.
Bikini Atoll, you escalate to, and if you watch the movie Oppenheimer, not to put any spoilers out there, but you notice that there is a guy talking about hydrogen.
That's right.
And just the hydrogen is so much easier to deal with than plutonium or uranium.
Yeah.
And it yields that much more destruction.
Yeah.
It's a weapon to end the world.
It really is. And so we say, how many do we need? Should we get 20 of them? No, that's not enough.
Right.
dozens.
We need enough to destroy the world several times over.
Yeah, it did. So at some point it seems a little redundant, doesn't
Yeah.
it? I mean, if I have 500 of them, you say, you know what? 500 of these bombs, that should be sufficient, right?
Right.
Well, I don't know. How many does the Soviet Union have?
Right.
It's irrelevant how many they
The
have.
arms race. Yeah.
Yeah, and we end up in this, and we spend a lot of money on this, and it also pushed, though, I think, it not only bad things in that way,
Right.
but it also spurred on some innovation,
Yeah.
right? Like the space race, where Soviet Union puts up Sputnik, right? And we're like,
Right.
oh man, we're behind, and so we want to kick it in gear.
Well, even movies now are talking about fifth gen fighters, right? Fighter planes. That stealth technology. That's a direct result of the Cold War. They come up with stealth technology, and even the Russians have it now.
And we end up with
So
like Saturn V rockets and all sorts of, but and a lot of that,
the race to the moon.
it is the race to the moon, and then all of that stuff comes from, a lot of it comes from German scientists
Werner von
we end up
Braun
with,
and several others.
their tech, post-war. Um, but it doesn't stay in that realm. It bleeds over into the Christian realm in the way that
Right.
sermons were preached and how people talked about their faith,
So
individuals.
the end of the world, I think, is more real to people because of the nuclear weapons than it has ever been.
He's right. It changes everything because up to that point, what's known as like post-millennialism was a more prominent idea about
Right.
in an that.
Eschatological.
It was a more prominent idea. It was a more prominent idea about the end of all things, eschatology,
Right.
in that study, because postmodernism, goodness,
Well, we're getting there.
because post millennial, right, the world was going to essentially get better,
Right.
and that progress was that idea of progress also led to war and to bad ideas too.
Right. Right.
Like eugenics and things like that, where you could improve the world, and all of a sudden it all came crashing down.
Wouldn't you say like theology of like Karl Barth, would be heading in that direction where we're improving society through through Christianity.
That's right. And conforming,
and so we move away from that.
We do, because it was wanting to make, say, Jesus's words in the Lord's Prayer come to pass,
Right.
to cause God's will on earth
as it
is in heaven.
Right.
That idea, I think, was a pressing one, and
Right.
and I think that was more of the American ideal,
right,
from early on, leading into that.
I think modern Christians, quite a few of them, they look on the world today and they're like, they see things getting worse and worse, and it ain't the way it used to be.
Sure.
And a lot of that comes from this Red Scare Cold War idea that we're heading into talking about.
That's right.
Where that wasn't present in the 1900s to 20s, right. Things like that.
It wasn't there. And all of a sudden, the world isn't getting better. Look how terrible it is. We're about to go into another war, right? How bad is that going to be? How many people are going to die this time?
And think about how much better, in a way, things are today than they were back then.
Yeah.
Is the world getting better? I'd say in some ways, absolutely.
In some ways it is. There's tons of progress, and things are where, as far as like medical technology, just a number of different things.
I think it makes for a much more hopeful theology. I mean, I'm coming from a dispensationalist background, and I find, looking back on my old views of things, it's a very negative approach.
Yeah.
And I don't think the gospel in any way is negative like that. I like that. I like that.
News, right?
Yeah.
Evangelion is the good news.
I like the urgency that theology presents. And I think we do need the urgency, but I don't think the fear that comes from that is good.
Yeah, because it wasn't really about that before. It was like, this is what God has done for me, and I want other people to share this.
Right.
And after World War II, it changed. And because people were afraid of these nuclear weapons and all this other stuff that they didn't understand.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there are microwaves now, and you can cook something inside of a box. And when you open it up, it wasn't hot in there. Like, what's going on, right?
Right.
The strange stuff that's happening in the world. And there were tons of unknowns like that.
Well, and the war between religion and science amped up.
It
I mean,
did.
really, they shouldn't be at odds with each other, but they are because of, that.
That's right. That time period.
Right.
And so all of that is happening, and people were afraid. And so suddenly, what becomes more popular from the pulpit is a premillennial eschatology. In other words, that Jesus would come back and
Right.
take people out of this world so they didn't have to experience
Premillennial
bad things.
rapture. And,
Yeah.
this is something I've studied many times, rapture as biblical theology. Really, there's only one place you could justify in Thessalonians, where he talks about dead in Christ rising and us meeting him in the air. That's the only place that you could justify a rapture, if you will. Otherwise, it's nowhere else in Scripture.
And way nobody knows where. So
and that moment in Thessalonians doesn't have to be premillennial.
Right. That's right. That's right. And as an aside, nobody's sure where that theology came from.
The premillennial.
No, that I'm talking about what Paul says there.
Oh yeah.
It's not present in Jewish literature or any other place. It's sort of just.
Well, I mean, that's that overall idea of the resurrection.
It is, and I think he was just trying to encapsulate it in a different way. But
right.
Nevertheless, all that fear, that idea. So now, oh, thank God, I don't have to deal with the bad things that my parents' generation dealt with.
Right.
I don't have to worry about war and all this because God's going to take us out of the world, right, and I won't suffer.
It's sort of an escapism.
It is. It's an escapism from the world, and so now I'm going to talk to people about Jesus, and I'm going to use that fear, of the world.
Regarding the Great Tribulation, Jesus talks specifically about the days of that. Now, I personally think he's talking about that period of time between then and 70 AD when the Jews are dealing with the destruction of Jerusalem.
Right.
I think it deals with that. But he says, but for the sake of the elect, those days were shortened.
That's right.
To me, that's saying, hey, we the elect are not going to be removed from any tribulation. We have to face it just like everybody else.
And I hear people, say things like, well, it's going to be worse though. Like, well, what does worse mean? If somebody's burning me,
well,
these can't be burnt worse.
Little lion-faced locusts with teeth biting you, that's kind of it's this magical, like fear.
It's that, but for many people around the world, they've experienced things that I'll never have to experience, I hope. But and it's not because they were evil, it's just that thing happened. I wouldn't have wanted to be, I don't know that I would have wanted to be on that first boatload of people that came to the shores of the U.S.
Oh, yeah.
In terrible winter, and half the people
died. Yeah, you're 50-50 chance of making it, right?
Can you imagine? Look, so can you imagine the same theology, say, from the 50s and 60s, where the 1950s and 1960s, where people were saying, hey, things are going to get bad, but don't worry about it. Before it gets real bad, Jesus is going to take you out. It's only going to be the people that don't believe that suffer.
I mean, would the pilgrims have even made their movement? Because they're saying double predestination, right? So
it wouldn't matter to them.
They don't. I mean, if God's going to take you out, why would you even move?
But if you transplanted that theology, if you just took a random street preacher that is preaching that and dropped them in Massachusetts.
Well, they're going to run him to Rhode Island for sure.
Exactly. And you go in there and you tell these people, they're watching everybody die. They're starving to death. They're frozen. They come up in the morning and find somebody's frozen. All the plants we tried to grow died because there's not enough water.
Right.
There's not enough rain. And then street preacher knocks on your door and says, hey, guess what? It's just going to get worse. I'm like, it's not going to get worse for them. They're frozen to death. they're already dead.
Right.
Like, what are you talking about? Like, it wouldn't have made any sense,
Right.
in that context.
Worse than what?
Worse than what?
Right.
If I'm tortured until I die,
Right.
that's it.
And the other thing about that Great Tribulation that they speak of, if you look at something like the Left Behind series, they're promoting the idea that people would still be saved, and like because of the tribulation, people would hear the message.
Yeah.
And God is like that, right? God is, his goal is for people to accept the gospel and be saved. But I don't think that the pouring out of his wrath, coupled with that idea, I don't think that works.
I don't know that it makes some of it doesn't make any sense to me. And because some of it is very, detailed. That some people's
Right.
idea of eschatology is extremely detailed.
Right.
And I know people are trying to reach back to the early church with it, but Chiliism, which is another church, is not the same. It's just not.
Right.
Especially the details. I've heard people talk about, well, these flying locusts, they're really Apache helicopters, and this flesh getting pulled off, that's a nuclear weapon.
Well, they're certainly not. They're certainly not little fairy lion beasts that have sharp teeth and.
Well, yeah, exactly. The other problem that you got in Book of Revelation is it's so much of it is highly symbolic.
Well, yeah, you've got a first century man.
Be taken symbolic.
You have a first century man on Patmos, seeing things that he could not even come close to explain, and now you've got 21st century people looking back at it, trying to interpret it.
Yeah, and casting their own culture.
Not using that hermeneutic, right? They're using this idea that, hey, what does this mean for me now in 2024?
Yeah,
it does mean something for us.
Sure,
but they're looking for a prophetic angle.
Well, I think people are starting with what does it mean for me, rather than starting here at the text.
Right.
I think people are wanting that first, some kind of way.
Well, my own personal Bible study. When I got my parents gave me a Bible very young, and my initial inclination is I'm going to read the Book of Revelation because it's exciting.
Sure.
Right. And I did, and yeah. And the thing is, when you read Revelation and then read the rest of the Bible in light of it, you get a very different view. Later in life, I was challenged by some things and looked into it, and I said, you know what, I'm going to read the words of Jesus first and then read Revelation.
That's right.
And you get a completely different picture. Right. Completely different.
The foundation matters. Some of the, we've been doing some series on people who were like mutilating scripture, and early like Gnostics and people like that, and the foundational material, the way that I go about reading this thing actually matters. And it changes the way that I see all of the texts.
Right.
It just does. And that, our culture sort of bled into that. And in the early church, Platonic views, this dualism idea, fueled much of the heretical movements in the early church.
Right.
For at least the first 600 or 700 years.
Right.
It was dominant.
If you look at Greek theology, right? I mean, not theology, Greek philosophy. Dualism comes from Plato, but then that 5 sense method of the scientific method comes from Aristotle.
That's right.
If you factor that in, that changes your worldview a little bit.
It does.
I think both are correct in a way.
They
right?
do, but later they try to, to map onto Aristotelian philosophy.
Right.
Right. Which people like Thomas Aquinas and stuff like that later. But Plato, though, is much more pagan. I don't know how else to say it. I mean, obviously Aristotle is too. It's pagan, but it is.
I think going back to Socrates, you had an idea that there is something out there beyond these mythological gods, right?
That's right.
And I think that's where Paul comes in on Mars Hill with the whole unknown God.
Well, some of the views, like the Platonic views, though, are it again is highly dualist. It is, there is the pleroma and the kenoma.
Right.
There's the out there where there's the perfect, the ideal, and the good.
Right.
and then there is the terrible, the corrupted, the vulgar.
Well, and I think we definitely see it in Scripture because Paul talks about now we see through a glass darkly, and it's straight from Plato.
Sure, some of there is some of that in there. The book of Hebrews too,
And
maybe.
Hebrews, when you're talking about the perfect temple,
Sure, it bleeds into there a bit, and I think that that's used to convey something that does have deep meaning.
Right.
That I get, and it works.
Well, yeah.
But just because that part works doesn't mean that I need to apply it in
to
every
everything,
way.
right?
Because some of the early Gnostics were applying everything onto Christianity.
Well, and
They
I think
started with where they were, and then they fit the Bible into what they wanted it to be.
the field of philosophy advanced in ways that are good, but the field of theology did not necessarily follow suit. You get to Cartesian theology. Not theology. Cartesian philosophy is pretty good stuff. I think therefore I am, and some stuff like that. Getting to the being and existence and all of that sort of thing. That's good.
Sure.
But I don't find that theology has kept pace with that.
Well, it gets hung up.
It does.
And
obviously, it took them a while to branch from dualism to Aristotelian, and then.
Yeah, and I think some of them are doing it from the beginning, but it's everybody's flirting with Plato, right?
Right.
But some of them are getting at the meat of it, I think, from the beginning.
Right.
But the heretics are never getting at something else. It is always this dualistic thing,
right.
which leads to other things too, like it's Satan. Good God and a bad God, which is what.
Well, you have like Marcion, where
he's another one that I've already,
Marcion, Arius, all of that.
They're all that way. Like I said, that dualism idea, the good God and the bad God.
Would you even say the new God? Islam sort of springs up in that Nestorian area? Is that even connected in that way?
I don't know. That there's some other stuff happening at the same time. There's Manichaeism.
Because in some ways, and I know we're trying to aim at the Red Scare, but you're kind of looking at the modern version of that. I would say that we're kind of looking at
it's the same thing. I think it's that this is the worldview that I have now,
right?
And my worldview is that I'm scared,
right?
Essentially, I might burn up at any time, and everybody that I know is going to die, and everything's going to fall apart, or I'm going to have this long lingering wait for my death while I'm suffering because I have cancer from nuclear weapons, or somebody else is going to take over my nation. I won't be able to worship because they don't believe in God, and all of that is all there at one time. So what I need to do, since this is my foundation, is I'm going to take the Bible and I'm going to fit it down inside of my foundational mold here.
Right.
And I think that's how that theology came out.
Right.
I think of people even like that are well known, and not only they well known, he's well known, like W.A. Criswell, was well respected, well known. But I remember reading a story. He said he was leaving church one day, First Baptist Dallas, and he had preached, and he finished preaching. He stood up there, gave an invitation, wanted people to come forward. Nothing happened. It's a fairly large church, right? First Baptist Dallas has always been big.
It's huge, yeah.
So he gets in the car with his wife. They're headed home, and he tells his wife, he said, "Hey, I can't believe, nobody made any decisions today. I just heard." He said, "I preached my heart out, and I researched this, and I did, And he said she looked at him and said, "What did you want him to do? Join the army?" Because she said most of his sermon was directed just against communism.
Right.
It wasn't for Jesus. It was against communism. And what are people supposed to do with that information? And he said, that made him really think about what he was doing.
Right.
And that was sort of an awakening for him. But I think there's a lot of people that never sort of woke up from that.
Right. Well, at least in the respect of that premillennial version of their theology, I never encountered the anti-communist side of that, but it was present.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it. that theology was very strong in my neck of the woods.
Yeah.
In fact, my mother, I don't know if she'd appreciate me saying this, but she's always read a Schofield Bible.
Sure.
And I even bought her a new Schofield Bible, and I think she's still using that.
Yeah.
And we know Ryrie Schofield; those are they're
well, they fit right into that mold.
Yeah, they're what do you call them? References.
Mm-hmm.
Point in that direction. They point into that dispensational,
right?
Theological bent, so to speak. One of the evangelists, I won't name his names, but when I got saved, he preached a revival, and he was very heavily into the dispensational theology, and he talked about the United States being in what we would call the Laodicean period of the church, if you will.
That's right.
A lot of my own theology was like, I don't want to be Laodicea. What do we do to fix that?
Well, that's so funny about that is that's what the Gnostics would have done in the early church.
Right.
Is allegorize scripture in that way.
Right.
To create this new meaning, which was condemned. But we don't realize, I think, what we're doing.
Well, no, because it's subtle. It doesn't, that didn't come on like, hey, this is the new theology, check it out. It's pieces, right?
Yeah.
And you look at the world, and it is getting bad because of nuclear weapons or whatever, and I guess that just kind of comes together. Hey, he's saying the world's going to get worse. Well,
here it is. Yeah, and I think it was almost natural then that evangelistic methods and all sort of moved toward fear in that way.
Right.
I don't know if it was necessarily intentionally I want to scare them into it. I just mean if the people who are doing the evangelism have legitimate concerns and fears, it comes out in their theology, in their preaching, when they're talking to other people and say, well, wait a minute, haven't you heard what's going on with Soviet Union, right?
Right.
And, hey, man, you don't know. You need to accept Jesus now because tomorrow you may not be able to go to worship. You may not be able to be baptized, whatever.
Right.
It was that sort of thing was kind of just in the air.
Some of that came into you never know when the end's going to come, which that's not a bad way of thinking. But if fear is the driving force, there's a problem.
Yeah, and that's where it is for me. It's not so much that people have ideas about, there should be urgency. It's simply that if fear is my main motivation for why I would go to church or why I would, worship,
I gotcha.
That's problematic.
That might be a good place for us to tie this back into what our original topic was, because fear, I think it's the driving force behind what we were aiming at. I don't think we quite got to the Red Scare yet, but that's something we wanted to talk about. So
right. Yeah, so let's jump into that. I mean, because that's affected culture in general. I think all the way to today. But
right.
So you want to start? How does that really?
I'm not exactly sure how to jump into it, but
I don't know either.
You wind up with a point where people in America are thinking that other Americans are plotting communism, so to speak.
It's basically a conspiracy theory.
And you do have communist movements in America. I mean, go watch Oppenheimer if you're interested in that. It's very interesting. Coming to the point of where any workers' union is seen as communistic, which I would say that some workers' unions are very American.
Right.
That's kind of a weird jumping off point, but the Red Scare is birthed out of that.
Yeah.
Because you have the labor movement, and a lot of that labor movement leans into communism. Yeah. And you get people on the opposite side of that want to eradicate that. And you get people like Joseph McCarthy come in there with a piece of paper in his hand and say, I have a list of known communists in the House of Representatives. And,
that's right.
I have it on this list. And, legend has it that was a blank piece of paper. But, That's the Red Scare,
McCarthyism,
right?
and
He eventually gets censured by Congress, by the way,
sure,
because he's found to be, I guess, a pot stirrer.
yeah, he's full of,
right,
but that created and fear on another level,
right,
right? Because it's one thing to think this enemy nation might cause me trouble.
right.
It's a different level when I think, wait a minute,
That's subversiveness,
there's government secrets I don't know about,
right,
right? At the end of World War II, and now there's people that are supposed to be governing me that might actually be playing for the other team,
right,
and now it becomes this vast conspiracy.
right.
What's actually happening, and that's politics are shaped by it. I almost feel like that kind of mentality is still around
Oh,
today.
no doubt, no doubt.
The way that
It's got a different bent, but it's still there.
yeah,
Yeah,
once we unearthed that method, we kept it.
right.
Because if we can use it to our own advantage, then we will.
I was watching
When you
something.
start labeling people,
Right.
labels are important.
It was fairly recent. I was watching something where it talked about one of the greatest, like, anti-American spies. Actually, wasn't from the Soviet Union. They were from Cuba, and they were right inside of our own DIA, which I didn't even know that
Yeah.
DIA was a thing. But apparently, CIA is the Central Intelligence Agency. That's kind of the civilian intelligence.
Yeah, both the departments.
Where DIA is the Defense Intelligence Agency. So she was actually working in the Defense Intelligence Agency and reporting back to Cuba.
Yeah.
About our activities.
We didn't know about her until she was gone. Right?
Very well. She got arrested and things, but is rather
something else I'm thinking about. Yeah. But there's because there's been a lot of spies from Cuba that have made it all the way back to Havana
because she was in the DIA.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big deal when you think about it.
It is.
That somebody rose to that height that was actually on the other side.
And that right there, those kinds of things where you have this truth, right? Okay, there is somebody who has infiltrated,
right?
Who is playing for the other team,
right? Well, and you also missed the Soviets do get the bomb because of spies. I mean, it's no other way around it.
But if you find one, all you have to find is one thing like that, and you hear people say things that, hey, there are some more of them, right?
Right.
And now you're on edge, and again, it shapes everything, shapes politics, shapes the way you think about life, and I think that idea shapes even the way that we read scripture, right?
Right.
Or the way that we think about theology, because if these conspiracies are at work all over within our government, all over everywhere, that's how Satan works. That's that's what we would say.
Well, something that we've kind of been at odds with in terms of Christianity in Hollywood. And it's interesting to look at the Red Scare's effect on Hollywood, because you had when McCarthy comes out with his list, you end up with something called the House Un-American Activities Committee, and they were actually investigating American citizens on their connections to communism. I mean, I think even Lucille Ball, the actress, had to go before the House Un-American Activities Committee.
Right.
You had baseball teams, Cincinnati Red Lights instead of the Reds. I'm not sure if the Red Sox altered anything at the time, but you get the idea. That's been around a lot longer than communism, but
that's right. You're gonna apply it.
Yeah.
But in that, so I think that reflects politically what was happening theologically,
right?
That was happening in the churches.
Well, and then you almost get a bite back in Hollywood, if you will. The propaganda and direction of our movies tend to take the counter argument, if you will, not going to the point of saying, "Hey, communism is right," but are we going a little overboard and questioning and protesting that?
What you are,
right? And I find that not communism, Hollywood tends to kind of combat our ultra anti-communist angle. You know,
I think they always kind of do that, no matter what the thing is at the moment. You
right.
know, it's sort of their deal. You know,
Right. But as to why we're at odds with that is because they were in a way targeted by the Red Scare.
Yeah.
You know,
We need to eliminate the enemies that are within.
right.
Right. Was the idea, and that bled over into the way that pastors and ministers were chosen, because churches then, when they're in these pastor search committees, they're interviewing people, they would want to know what eschatology that particular preacher has before they called them.
I've even encountered that. You know, getting a job as at a school teaching.
Yeah.
You know, they had a questionnaire that you had to fill out, and you know, eschatology was one of the major topics.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there was a time, if you didn't identify exactly in the way that they thought you should,
right,
that you're out.
You're not getting hired.
It's the same.
Yeah.
So that cultural problem wasn't just a cultural problem that affected politics; it affected absolutely everything.
Right.
And again, infiltrating that way, it's not so much as an issue as much as it was. It's still present out there, but it's fading. It was a hot, hot button issue in deciding whether somebody was on the right side or the wrong side. Are they with us or them?
Well, and I think theologically, the majority are still in that camp.
Sure, but people aren't as dogmatic about it as they were. It's not, the eschatology scare like the Red Scare was, but at one point it was.
Right.
It was to the same level as I've got a list.
Well, we get the idea that we need to separate the sheep from the goats. That's not our job.
Right.
You know,
people think they need to enforce God's rule, right? Which sort of takes us back to the Puritans in that way, right? Of making it, we want it to be, like it needs to be.
And there are absolutely movements today bent in that direction.
There are, and then you've got Hollywood's response, right? With today still, I know *Handmaid's Tale* is an older book, but that's the kind of response that Hollywood presents. If it looks like things are going to the right theologically, if it's going to the right theologically, then it's going to be *Handmaid's Tale*. Like it goes all the way to the point where it's total domination and control of everybody religiously,
right?
Which is what like the Puritans would have wanted. But that's not. That's an extremism.
This is going to be a weird bit on this, but anti-Semitism kind of fits into this picture because you look back at communism's creation, and you got Engels and people like that were actually Jewish.
Yeah.
And then right after that, that's Nazism is almost an exact reaction to that. The anti-communist, so to speak. They go all the way to the right.
And fascism.
Right. And some of that was a bent against that, what they would call Jewish theology, or Jewish ideology. Communism is seen by some as being created by the Jews, and that anti-Semitism being a part of this. So the Red Scare, when you're looking at the House Un-American Activities Committee, one of the things they're looking for is, this person's Jewish. Well, maybe they have communist leanings.
Yeah.
And so that's, in a way, as you pointed out, the idea that we just stop the Holocaust and the anti-Semitism is still present.
Yeah.
That's
funny. I mean, to me, it's just like, but my framework is so different for the way I think about the world because, I didn't grow up in that era, right? But linking those things together, it doesn't make any sense in my mind, But
well, it's hard to make a connection there too, because you're talking about the people preaching dispensational theology that are anti-communist because it's this Jewish ideology, but at the same time, they're the same folks that want to bolster and protect the nation of Israel.
Yeah,
that's an interesting. Because they still see the Jews as God's chosen people, and that eschatologically something's supposed to happen with them.
Yeah.
So
Well, you think maybe that's it. They're thinking though that there's like, the good Jews and the bad Jews or something.
maybe, but I mean, I think in the long run, what they're looking at is um, they see the end of times and the eschatology is being related to Israel, and so something has to happen there. So they're willing to promote people that they probably wouldn't
So it's
agree
for their
with.
own end, not really for the Jewish people. Like they think if I do this for the Jewish people, there's a reward essentially.
Right. They see it as God would favor the Jewish people, so I should too. You know.
Hmm. Yeah, I never thought about it like that. But that's interesting to think about it in that way because at first you just sense, well, you have to support Israel because the Bible says, right? But not thinking that through like a dispensationalist would, in the sense that this is like what must come next kind
Right.
of thing, you know.
Well, the rebuilding of the temple is part of the whole
Sure.
scheme of the dispensational idea. It has to happen, and so if you have no Israel, how does that happen?
And you have some, depending on what circles you're in, because there's all sorts of different, levels of this. From, you know, some of them are more detailed than others. Some of them are premillennial, but not really dispensational at all. But some of them will go so far as to they have to rebuild the temple and
Well, we've had
sacrifice,
government
whatever.
policy that's been shaped by this.
Yeah,
I mean, everything that we've done for Israel or promoted with Israel
since post World War II.
since World War II. I mean, the nation is created in '48.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all the things going on with that even now. That's still
Related to the way that we broke up the property in that region.
that's right.
Yeah,
And you know, I mean, granted, the British,
especially I think the way that the old Ottoman Empire was broken up.
right? That and well, and even the British Empire, because that Palestine would have been a British protectorate. Um, and
Well, post World War One. See, that's what I'm saying.
right,
Like, I think it's going back all the way, really, to World War One.
right. Well, in some ways, goes back to the Crusades even.
Sure.
But um, and I think that a lot of that ideology that we've promoted, even as a governmental level,
Mm-hmm.
probably needs to be evaluated differently. Not that we don't need to support Israel, but the reason for doing it is not quite the same as what
The original intent.
the original intent.
Yeah,
And
it was like we need a place for the Jewish people to call their own.
in a sense, that's a focal point of the Cold War, even
Yeah.
because you look at how the United States backs Israel versus how the Soviet Union would back somebody like Iran. You know, and the Soviet Union being largely Russia, not having their Orthodox background at that point in time, is backing an Islamic state
Yeah.
based on the fact that they're a secular state, opposed to this Western idea
Yeah.
that there needs to be a functioning Israel. And then anti-Semitism exists on that side as well.
Sure.
So that's
From a different
from
perspective.
a totally different perspective.
Yeah. It's so crazy how so that sort of ending up on the wrong side of a lot of people's radar, at one time.
Right.
And some of it doesn't make any sense. Some of it does from the perspective of those people. But it's crazy. So like the Red Scare essentially leads to, I think, bad policy.
Right.
Bad
Absolutely.
policy. And it leads to bad decisions about foreign policy.
Well, and it leads to a lot of reactive politics too, which kind of go too far the other way.
Yeah.
And you almost have some of our partyism heading along those ideological lines.
Mm-hmm.
This is probably where we start calling it the left and the right in the United States, right? Like, I don't think if you go back to the time of just post Civil War, we're talking about Republicans and Democrats. I don't think you bring up left and right of the spectrum at all. I don't think it exists in that way. You know, a lot of times today we'll look at it and you'll say Democrats are on the left, Republicans are on the right.
Yeah.
But
It
really,
wasn't really like that then.
we've always been moderate, really.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's where that comes in.
What do you mean you go all the way back to progressive Republicans?
The labeling of left and right comes out of the Cold War. I mean, and you know, one party's suspicious of the other party as being more in line with communists.
Yeah.
You know, and,
All related to the same thing.
right. I mean, in some ways they are more in line with socialism, but that may be a reaction.
Yeah.
You know, you've been saying it all along. Well, we might as well go with it because it's what you've been saying. You know.
You know, I'm thinking about like 100 years from now, you know, when historians are looking back at the time leading up to that and even to now, you know, what they might say about U.S. culture and politics at the moment, what it was shaped by, and how that worked out. And I think the same thing could, you know, church historians looking back at the theological discussions that are happening and
Mm.
the way that how would I be evaluated, right? I think about those kinds of things, you know, in the way that I try to think about, excuse me,
Well, you
the
have
way
the
that I
whole
try to think about theology and you know, what's where am I going to be as history looks back at me? You know, what are people going to see? Am I going to be like when I look back at the early church and say, well, you know, this guy was really a kind of a heretic
right,
on the edge of this movement that lasted for 200 years and then went away?
right.
You know, we have to be careful, I think, that we don't get sucked into
I think we got to remember
whatever
that.
has the strongest gravitational pull at the moment.
I think we have to remember that God saves heretics.
He does.
That's the whole part. You know, when I was in seminary, I encountered a conversation about even Methodists,
Yeah.
and we were talking about the concept of damnable heresy. And I was thinking, is heresy really damnable?
Yeah.
And I think when you get down to it, and this is another topic, Christology, when you
Yeah.
get into that, you know, you either have saving faith or you don't. The other stuff, we're human. We're going to get some of it wrong. And
Well, we're always getting some of it wrong, right? Because I mean, even you know, if you look back at say what say Bart Ehrman would call the proto-Orthodox Church, because it's before Nicaea,
right,
but they would fit within the Nicene Creed.
creed,
Some of the things that they espoused don't necessarily line up with what Christians would believe later.
right,
It's kind of outside that,
right,
and they wouldn't have done it that way, wouldn't have said it that way, and people today say, that makes me nervous that you just said it like said that. It's
right,
not right.
right,
We would still say that they were Christians, that they were Orthodox, you know,
right.
even though they're on the edge of it.
But
So
it almost creates that same red scare in the church, if you think about it.
it does.
And it's still going on. It's still there. Um,
I don't know that we ever get away from it. You know, there's
well,
always looking for a new enemy.
kind of to wrap it up, you know, you were talking about how will history perceive us, you know, and I think we go back to that old Baptist argument where you had two versions of Baptists, where one says education is good
Yeah.
and the other says that education is not.
Mm-hmm.
And that side that says that it's not tends to fall into the heresy very quickly.
Yeah.
And the best way to avoid it, heresy, is it's just like counterfeits. You know the real thing. So education is a good thing.
It matters. It matters. And it matters not only for theology and church history, it matters in our culture for our foreign policy decisions and all the rest. You know, if there was another war, if there was another scare, so to speak, how will we react?
Right.
Will we react in the same way we did before and to learn nothing?
Right.
Or will we say, hey, that's the wrong way to go about this?
Right.
You know?
And I think if you come down on the side of education, you come down on the side of you're the educated theologian that's attempting to do it the right way based on a proper hermeneutic of scripture, I think that you're going to be on the better side of history.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the winning side,
Right.
but
Right. I understand. And the same thing is true politically and everything else, right? how do we wrap things up? How do we tie things in a bow? What if there is a legitimate fear of there's something going on? How do we go about dealing with it?
Right.
Because I don't think today that we would round up everyone of the ethnicity of whatever country we were at war with, like we did with Japan.
Right.
I think we've moved past that.
Right. Which notably, the other two, Italians and Germans, were not rounded up.
That's right.
And the racial policies, I think, have changed to a great degree. There's a lot that want to go around saying that we still have those racial policies in place, but I think you're right. I think we
moved past that.
We've gotten past that.
But I think that's why the Red Scare was so scary for people, because these people that are on the other side, they look just like you and I.
Yeah.
You can't tell.
But then again, there was a lot of racism in that.
There was.
Because when you look at things like, and this is going back to the 1920s Red Scare,
anybody you want.
The early Red Scare, the 1920s, you've got the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. They are anarchists, okay? They're Italian. Different than what the nativist American would be, and so they largely get an unfair trial because of their race, not because of the genuine nature of them being subversive.
They actually thought or being,
and that's some of that early, there's more than one Red Scare. That's some of the early Red Scare. And it's not just fearing communism, you're fearing anarchy as well, which anarchy, obviously, there's some problems with that. But and it tended to be your Eastern, Southern Europeans that had these opinions where the majority of the United States at the time was different than that.
That's right.
And so they're fearful of that,
We fear what we don't understand. We fear what we think might be.
Or different.
As Alfred Hitchcock would have said, the monster that you don't see is scarier than the one that you do on the screen.
Right.
Which is why he never showed them.
Right.
And Alfred Hitchcock is perfect, I think, to think about this as the Red Scare because of when those episodes are playing.
Right. 50s, right?
The 50s.
Yeah.
And that was what people thought, like there's a monster here and I just can't see it, which is worse.
Right.
Because at least I can run from something.
That almost ties back into our other one, talking about, the spiritual forces that we think about and things like that.
Well, I think we're going to put a bow on this.
Okay. I think it's the right idea.
Yeah. And there's plenty more topics that we're going to deal with.
Right.
But
this one might have a part 2 based on.
Yeah, it may have to.
Yeah.
There's just too much to deal with. So, but thanks for coming on.
All right.
And we'll see you guys next time.